There is a green hill far away, outside a city wall, where our dear Lord was crucified, who died to save us all. Amen. Amen. So today, in our journey through Luke, we have reached the 16th chapter. We are now 2/3 through the Gospel of Luke, just 1/3 to go. So let us begin by reminding ourselves of the story so far. Jesus' public ministry began in the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel, and it began with a grand command, a grand statement, a prophetic statement taken from the prophet Isaiah. He stood up in the synagogue and proclaimed, I have come to bring good news to the poor. I have come to set the prisoners free. I have come to open the sight of the blind. I have come to free the oppressed and to proclaim the Lord's favour. So already Jesus was thinking outside the box. He didn't come to the elite, he didn't come to the religious rulers in that sense. He came to the marginalized. And if you read Luke carefully, a great section of it is all about the last, the least, the lost, and those whom many considered were dead already. The last, the least, the lost, and those who considered many were dead already. As I mentioned, we're now in the 16th chapter of Luke. If you were here last week, you would have recalled the Gospel from the beginning of the 15th chapter in Luke, which is actually, would you believe, all about loss. It was the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the woman who lost a precious coin. But today we have jumped from chapter 15 to chapter 16. And we have missed a large portion of chapter 15. Now why those who put the lectionary together have done this, goodness knows. Because actually, the last part of chapter 15 is very important in the light of what we have just listened to, that very intriguing and I would say mystifying parable. The parable which follows the lost sheep and the lost coin is also another parable, and one very, very familiar to us, probably the most well-known. The parable of the prodigal son, which is also about loss and actually death. But it is linked to the parable we have just listened to. And you may think, my goodness me, what's that got to do with the price of cheese? How can the prodigal son be linked to what we've just read now? Well, I'll tell you. It revolves around a Greek word. And important that we remember this. So you can go up to Mother Victoria this week and say, have you considered diaskorazin? And she'll look at you and slap you around the face and say, don't be cheeky. Diaskorazin is an important Greek word linking the parable of the prodigal son and this parable. The Greek word means wasted, wasted. So in this story we've just read, when this whistleblower goes to the owner of the company and says, your manager has been squandering the capital, been squandering the books, been fiddling, squandering, the word actually is wasted. Wasted. He has wasted. He has wasted your time. He has wasted your energy through his managing of the company accounts. Now, if we think back to the prodigal son, the one who inherited his father's inheritance while he was still alive, and then took the money, fled the home, and spent it on a huge, lavish binge session, squandered the lot, bankrupted himself, and then we read, after he had wasted all that he had, when he was poor and impoverished, he had a dialogue with himself. Rather like the dialogue the manager of this company had with himself. What shall I do? What shall I do? Now the prodigal son decided that there was nowhere else to go actually except home. But he went home expecting death, for he had the words prepared to say to his father. Having lost everything, he now expected to lose more. For he was prepared to say to his father, Father, I am no longer worthy to be your son. He was expecting a death, to be cut off from all that he had previously enjoyed, from all that he had previously been involved in, from all that had been known to him as family. I am not worthy to be your son. But of course, as a great surprise to him, the father had other ideas. And from that point of loss and death came the possibility of resurrection. And so in this parable, this manager who wasted is now at the point of death, in the sense that when the owner finds out what he's been doing, he comes before him and says, look, I've heard this about you, about your accounting. You are fired. End of story. You are fired. So a loss and a death has come in the sense that he no longer has what he had previously. Now, if we look at this parable purely as a parable of morality, we can sit pretty comfortably and say to ourselves, well, stupid idiot. What does he expect if he's squandering and wasted his manager's time? He deserves the sack. Well done, mate. I could do a better job than that. And you can say to the owner, yeah, well, good for you. About time you sorted these lazy so-and-sos out. Yes, get someone decent in. If we look at it as a parable of morality, we can sit on a very high fence. But remember who told this parable, and remember what Jesus came to do, and remember who Jesus consorted with, and remember his works of bringing life out of death, bringing a future out of loss, bringing hope out of hopelessness, meeting people outside of the box. So perhaps we ought to look at this parable, as we do with the prodigal son, with the lost sheep, as a parable of grace. A parable of grace rather than a parable of morality. So if we look at this as a parable of grace, then we turn things upside down a bit. How do we look at it? Remembering who told this parable, who he told it to, and how Jesus has been functioning from chapter 4 up until this point. And also remembering the final third of the gospel, which we know very well what happens. So perhaps, the manager knows very well what's been going on with the boss. For when he brings the debtors in and finds how much they owe and the amount they owe, he's thinking to himself, well, that cheeky so-and-so. Yes, he's lent them, he wants his return, but they found it difficulty in reading the fine print which said there's compound interest on top of this. So you may have thought you were going to pay him back 10 barrels of olive oil, but you never read the fine print, did you, sunshine? And it's now 100 barrels of olive oil. I know this guy. And of course, the master is thinking, having dumped all this interest on them, he's thinking, well, they're going to take years to pay this back. Oh boy, I'll teach them to borrow money off me. And so this manager brings them in and says, right, okay, come on, let's see. Let's look at your situation. Basically, what can you give me? Come on, let's try and sort it out. And one says 50, one says 10, and right, done, brilliant, bang, good, buzz off. Presents it to the owner of the company, who's delighted, because he actually wasn't expecting a penny for many years. Probably wasn't expecting it at all. Or perhaps, the owner himself was a bit gullible. And it was those who borrowed, who were the so-and-sos, and probably went up to him and said to him, turning it around a bit, please, would you lend me some money? I've got to get to Boston. My grandfather's sick. Could you give me $2,000 for a first-class ticket to Boston? Oh, yes, yeah. Your grandfather's sick. Wasn't he sick 2 years ago? No, that was my great aunt. Oh, yeah, right. Well, I'll give you the money. Don't worry. And you pay it back when you can. And the manager knows how gullible this guy is and how he's always giving money and getting very little back, if anything, and brings these debtors in and says, look, he's been so good to you. He's been really good to you. We're in a spot of bother now, come on. And in both these instances, a light goes on, and perhaps light goes on in the heart, and money is paid back. So from verse 2, where we get you're fired, to verse 8, where the master says, wow, brilliant, sunshine, wonderful. You've got and brought in what I never really expected. Thank you so much. All in the space of 6 verses. From you're fired to top of the class, give out the pencils. Perhaps that's the parable of grace. Because we're not told what happened next. We're not told whether the manager got his job back. We're not told whether the owner was truly satisfied. We're not told whether the debtors were in a good situation regarding what they had to pay back. We're not told. But we're not told throughout the gospel the response of those whom Jesus met and healed, whether they were continually grateful, whether they followed him, whether they looked after him. We're not told. All we know that at the cross there were a few women, maybe 2 of the disciples who stood by him. So where were the 5,000? Where were the lepers who were cleansed? We don't know. We don't know. But what we do know with authority is Jesus' ministry of grace. Jesus' ministry of grace, who meets people where they are, and even meets those within the box, those who feel they're safe and secure, those religious leaders who are clinging on to temple ritual and their command of the old order, desperately afraid that they were losing it, which they were, for within 30 years the temple would have been ransacked, never to be rebuilt, and temple sacrifice and the ritual of that would never be seen or witnessed again. And Jesus' prophetic claim to the validity and truth of that by his own sacrificial death on the cross once for all, which provided the complete sacrifice. And Jesus reached out, even though he was critical, to those within the box, because he realized they were in prison too, that they were blind too, those who clung on to status, entitlement, wealth for its own sake, who could not let go. And we remember Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who stoned the prophets, how long would I have gathered you as a hen gathers a chicken under her wings? But you would not." So he had a care and compassion even for those he was critical of. And on that cross, outside a city wall, he died for us all. For those he criticized, for those he loved, for those who befriended, for those who gave. So this mystifying parable, don't see it as a parable of morality, but a parable of grace. And to remind ourselves that Jesus isn't condemning wealth in itself, isn't condemning a nice place to live, isn't condemning a lifestyle, but is asking us to see within those boundaries of how we can use that, how we can give, how we can serve God through the generous gifts he has given us. So today, for example, there's going to be a second collection for those who have suffered so much in the Bahamas. And we remember also the people of Texas who suffered so much from this recent tropical storm. And we remember what we went through in Sandy. So we give out of what we've received. We give generously because God has been generous to us. But we aren't enslaved to it. We see it as a God-given gift. and we see our stories as parables of